George stood in the rain, soaked to the bone, watching Allison disappear into the terminal without looking back. Her plane ticket was paid for by Jimmy, the man she said she didn't love, but somehow always returned to. George had no suitcase, no umbrella, no pride left, just the crumpled letter in his hand, the one she wrote in the middle of the night, before slipping away. "Take care of yourself, George. Don't come after me. This is goodbye." No explanation, no apology, just cold ink and colder intentions. Weeks earlier, everything had felt like it was falling into place. Allison had finally left Jimmy after years of emotional tug-of-war. George had stood by her through every fight, every lie, every midnight phone call she took outside so Jimmy wouldn't hear. She used to cry in George's arms, whispering how tired she was, how broken she felt, and how he made her feel safe. She had told him she loved him, but love, George had learned, was not always enough, especially not when a ghost named Jimmy lived in every room of her heart. It started unraveling when Cecilia entered the picture. She wasn't meant to be anything more than a distraction, a mutual friend who happened to smile when George needed someone to. Cecilia was patient, soft-spoken, and had eyes that didn't look through him the way Allison's often did. But even as he started spending time with her, George remained tangled in the memory of a woman who never fully chose him. Then came the night Allison called in a panic. Jimmy had overdosed. George rushed over without a second thought. At the hospital, she was a mess of tears and trembling hands, gripping George like a lifeline. "If he dies, it'll be my fault," she choked out. "I left him. I told him I loved someone else. And now he's like this." George didn't say what he was thinking. He's always been like this, selfish, manipulative, dangerous. Instead, he held her tighter. 2 days later, Jimmy was stable. Allison was not. She begged George to stay with Jimmy for a while to talk to him, to help him see a future beyond the bottle of pills. "He listens to you," she insisted. "You can get through to him, just until I figure things out." And George, like a fool, agreed. He spent weeks visiting Jimmy, hearing his rants, his sob stories, his fake promises to change. George watched as the man who'd once threatened him with a broken bottle now sat weeping over lost chances. But he did it for Allison, because she asked, because she cried. And then one evening, George came to find her gone. Cecilia was the one who found him spiraling. He was drunk, angry, shouting at the walls in his apartment. She didn't say much, just cleaned up the broken glass and sat beside him on the floor. When he asked her why she stayed, she simply said, "Because no one deserves to be used the way you were." Cecilia never asked about Allison. She never tried to be her. Instead, she brought light into his apartment, warmth into his quiet mornings. She laughed with her whole heart, and never once looked over her shoulder to see if someone better was coming. George didn't fall in love quickly, but he did, piece by piece, quietly. And when he finally realized it, it didn't feel like fireworks, it felt like peace. Allison's return came without warning. A message, a knock at his door, a smile he hadn't seen in months. "I'm back," she said, like she'd gone to the store and not another country. "Jimmy's in rehab. I needed time to think." George didn't invite her in. Cecilia was in the kitchen, barefoot, humming to herself. "I thought about you every day," Allison said, eyes glassy. "I thought about how you asked me to save him." George replied softly, "When I was drowning too." Her smile faltered. "I didn't know what else to do. You were always stronger than him." "No," he said. "I was just more in love." Cecilia called from the kitchen. "George, tea or coffee?" He turned slightly, not breaking eye contact with Allison. "Coffee." Allison looked down at her feet, then back at him. "Are you happy?" He nodded once. "I didn't think I would be, but yeah, I am." And as the door closed slowly between them, George didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel cruel. He just felt free. The next morning, George woke up to the smell of cinnamon and butter wafting from the kitchen. Cecilia was already moving around in her oversized sweater, hair messy, barefoot on the cold tiles. She looked over her shoulder with a warm smile. "Morning. I figured we could use something sweet today." George leaned on the doorframe, watching her. "You always know exactly what I need before I know it myself." Cecilia shrugged. "That's because you never say it out loud. You just carry everything like you're made of stone." He didn't answer. He walked over, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and just held her. Her body stilled for a second, then softened into him. For the first time in months, there was no weight in his chest, no echoes of old promises, just the quiet ticking of the clock and the woman who made silence feel safe again. But Allison's visit had stirred things: memories, anger, even guilt. He hadn't expected her to come back, and he definitely hadn't expected her to act like nothing had happened, like she hadn't begged him to keep Jimmy alive for her, then vanished without a single call. Later that afternoon, as Cecilia sat on the couch, with her legs tucked under her, flipping through a book, George stepped outside. He needed air, space, time to think. He walked down the street, hands in his coat pockets, letting the wind push against him. He didn't go far, just to the park near the bakery where he used to meet Allison on Sunday mornings. They used to sit on that crooked bench, drinking bad coffee, talking about everything and nothing. He thought about the last time they were there, how she held his hand but kept glancing at her phone, waiting for Jimmy to call. He hated that his mind still made space for her, but memory wasn't loyalty. It was just leftover pain. As he stood by the rusted railing, watching leaves scatter across the path, he heard someone call his name, George. He turned, and there she was again, Allison, dressed in a beige coat, no makeup, eyes searching. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said. "I didn't expect to see you at my door yesterday, so I guess we're even." She looked down, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I was scared you'd hate me." "I don't hate you," he said, "but I don't love you anymore either." She flinched slightly. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could fix things by stepping away, give you space, give Jimmy a chance to recover. You didn't give me space. You left me behind. You asked me to save someone you couldn't save, and when I did, you disappeared like it meant nothing." There was silence between them, thick and uncomfortable. "I was broken," she whispered. "And I didn't know how to love someone who actually stayed," George sighed. "And I was foolish enough to think love meant sacrifice. But you didn't ask me to love you, you asked me to carry your pain." Allison's eyes filled, but she didn't wipe the tears away. "Is she good to you, Cecilia?" "She's not perfect," George said, "but she's honest. And when she says she cares, she stays." He turned to walk away, but she called out once more, "If I'd chosen you first, would it have been different?" He stopped, not looking back. "You didn't choose me second. You chose me last." Then, he walked home, the sound of her quiet sobs chasing him down the path, but never quite catching up. At home, Cecilia was still on the couch, blanket wrapped around her, half asleep. When he sat beside her, she stirred. "You okay?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He just leaned over, kissed her forehead and whispered, "Yeah, I am now." The days that followed moved slower, calmer, like life had finally stopped spinning in circles. George spent more time with Cecilia, making dinner together, walking to the corner store just to argue over which kind of chocolate to buy, staying up too late watching old films neither of them really paid attention to. The ease of it scared him sometimes, not because it was too much but because it wasn't hard at all. And then the message came, a text from Jimmy. "You and me, one conversation. You owe me that much." George stared at the screen for a while, thumb hovering over the reply button. He didn't owe Jimmy a damn thing, not after the years of chaos, the manipulation, the way he played both Allison and George like they were puppets in some twisted play. But part of him, maybe the part that still wanted closure, couldn't just ignore it. He met Jimmy at a bar downtown. Neutral territory, not too crowded, not too quiet. Jimmy looked worse than the last time George had seen him, thinner, eyes sunken, like sobriety had stripped away whatever charm he once wore like armor. "You look like hell," George said, sliding into the booth. Jimmy let out a dry chuckle. "Sobriety does that. Real life does that." They sat in silence for a moment before Jimmy spoke again. "I didn't come to fight." "Then say what you came to say." Jimmy rubbed his hands together like they were cold. "Allison told me you were the one who sat by me in that hospital. That you showed up even after everything I did. Even after I tried to ruin you." George didn't flinch. "She asked me to. That's the only reason." "I know." Jimmy looked up, and for the first time, there was something like shame in his eyes. "And I've hated you for years, because she loved you more than she ever loved me. I saw it. I just thought, if I broke you down enough, she'd stop." George clenched his jaw, but said nothing. "I was wrong," Jimmy said quietly, "but I need to say this: thank you for not letting me die, even when I probably deserved to." George stared at him, trying to find anger, but there was just exhaustion. You didn't deserve to die, Jimmy, but you sure as hell didn't deserve her. Jimmy gave a bitter laugh. Neither did you, man. We were both just what she needed. At different times. You were the bandage. I was the wound. George didn't respond. He stood up slowly, grabbing his coat. She's still lost, Jimmy said. Even now, I don't think she'll ever really stop chasing ghosts. George paused before walking away. Then I'm glad I stopped being one. He didn't tell Cecilia about the meeting right away. Not because he was hiding anything but because he needed to sit with it himself, process it, let it breathe. That night, she noticed something was off. You're quiet, she said, her voice gentle. I saw Jimmy today. She didn't act surprised, just nodded. How'd it go? We were honest, he said, maybe for the first time ever. She set down her tea and looked at him. And how do you feel? Lighter, George admitted. Like I finally put something down I didn't even know I'd been carrying. Cecilia leaned her head on his shoulder. I don't care about your past. Just don't carry it alone anymore. He smiled softly. I won't. But peace has a way of unsettling people who've lived in chaos too long. And just when George thought he was done with the past came knocking again. This time, it wasn't Jimmy. It was Allison at his door, suitcase in hand, eyes red from crying. I have nowhere else to go, she whispered. Please, just tonight. And Cecilia was standing right behind him. George didn't answer right away. The air was too thick, the silence too loud. He looked at Allison, wet hair clinging to her face, suitcase trembling in her hand like she'd come straight from somewhere she never wanted to be again. And then, he looked at Cecilia, who hadn't said a word yet. Her eyes moved slowly between them, calm but unreadable. Just tonight, Allison said again, quieter this time. George turned slightly, his voice low. Cecilia. But Cecilia didn't step back. She didn't retreat. Instead, she opened the door wider and said calmly, you can stay. The couch pulls out. Allison blinked in surprise. Thank you. George stood there a moment longer, feeling the weight of two women who had changed his life in opposite ways standing inches apart. He stepped aside without a word, letting Allison into the warmth, though everything about the moment felt cold. Dinner was awkward. Allison sat stiffly, barely touching the plate Cecilia had kindly set for her. George barely tasted anything. Cecilia somehow remained composed, asking small questions where Allison had been staying, what made her come back, if she was okay. No judgment, no edge in her voice, just that cool steadiness that had always been her quiet strength. Allison kept her answers vague. Things didn't work out. I left a job I hated, got tired of running. I don't know where I belong anymore. And for a moment, George saw it. Not the girl who betrayed him, not the one who left him with Jimmy and a goodbye note, but the version of her that was real, tired, broken, searching. The version she tried to hide behind lovers and impulsive escapes. After dinner, George and Cecilia stayed in the kitchen while Allison took a shower. Cecilia dried her hands and leaned against the counter. You okay? George nodded slowly. I don't know what this is. I didn't expect her to show up like that. I know, she said softly, but I saw it in her face. She's not here to take you back, George. She's here because she lost everything, and you're the only one who ever didn't walk away from her. He stared at the floor, guilt crawling under his skin. It still hurts, seeing her like that. It should, Cecilia said, not unkindly. She was your storm, but I'm not afraid of the rain anymore. As long as you're not. Later, after Allison had fallen asleep on the couch, George lay in bed beside Cecilia, neither of them sleeping. She asked me once if she chose me first, would it have changed anything? He murmured into the dark. Cecilia shifted slightly. Would it have? No, he said, because she never really chose me at all. Silence stretched between them before Cecilia whispered, then make sure you're choosing now. He reached for her hand in the dark and held it tightly. The next morning, Allison was already up. She'd made coffee awkwardly, like someone trying to fix something they knew was broken beyond repair. I'll leave after this, she said, not meeting their eyes. I didn't come here to make trouble. George sat across from her, watching her quietly. You should call your mom, he said. She asked about you a few months ago. Allison looked up, surprised. You talked to her? She called me. Wanted to know if I knew where you were. Allison nodded slowly. Maybe I will. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't hug. Cecilia walked her to the door, gave her a small smile, and said, take care of yourself this time. When the door clicked shut behind her, George let out a long breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding. Cecilia turned to him and asked, "So what now?" And George, for the first time in years, had an answer. "Now we stop looking back." The following weeks passed with a strange stillness. Not the tense, uncertain quiet George once knew with Allison, but a grounded, peaceful one that he shared with Cecilia. They settled into a rhythm: early mornings with shared coffee, late nights with music and laughter. The air in the apartment no longer carried the ghost of someone who had left. It smelled like fresh laundry and new beginnings, but people talk. Especially in towns like theirs, whispers started drifting back to George about Allison staying at a motel outside the city, about her applying for work at the same bookstore she once mocked him for liking. It didn't take long before someone mentioned they'd seen her with Jimmy again, not fighting, not screaming, just together. Cecilia found him pacing the living room one evening, hands buried deep in his hair, phone buzzing on the table with yet another message from someone asking, "Did you know Allison's back with him?" She didn't interrupt right away. She just stood in the doorway, watching him unravel in slow motion. When he finally looked up, she said quietly, "It's not your mess anymore, George." "But it used to be," he said. "It used to be everything. I bled for her. I burned for her. And now she's just fine? Like nothing happened?" "She's not fine," Cecilia said. "She's surviving. Same way you did." He sank onto the couch, letting her words wash over him. It was hard to hear, but he knew she was right. "Why do I still care?" he asked. Cecilia walked over and knelt in front of him, placing her hands on his knees. "Because you're human. And because a part of you always wanted her to become the version of herself she never could be with you. But let that part rest now." He stared into her eyes, the calm center of the storm he'd escaped, and nodded. That night, George sat alone on the balcony while Cecilia slept, staring at the city lights. He thought about closure, how it didn't always come wrapped in a bow. Sometimes it came in the shape of distance, or in the warmth of someone new. And sometimes it came in knowing you were no longer someone's safe place and being okay with that. The next morning, he got a letter, a real one, handwritten, from Allison. "You'll probably never read this, but I need to say it. I loved you the way a drowning person loves the surface, desperately, but never long enough. I didn't know how to hold someone like you, solid, patient, kind. I thought if I could save Jimmy, maybe I could prove I wasn't broken. But I broke you instead. I'm sorry for all of it. You deserved more." George folded the letter once, then again, and placed it in the drawer beside his bed. Not because he wanted to keep it, but because throwing it away felt like pretending none of it had happened. And it had. All of it. Every ache, every lie, every moment that led him here. Later that week, he and Cecilia drove to the coast. No plans, no destination. Just windows down, music loud, hands clasped on the center console. They stopped at a beach, one neither of them had ever been to. The sky was pale and clouded, the wind sharp and playful. George kicked off his shoes and walked to the edge of the water, letting the cold bite his toes. Cecilia stood behind him, arms crossed against the breeze. "Feels like a different life, doesn't it?" He turned to her, nodding. "It was. And this is the one I choose now." She smiled, walking to his side. They stood there, silent, letting the waves erase the footprints behind them. Cecilia pressed her shoulder gently against George's as they stood at the edge of the sea. The wind tugged at her hair, flinging it across her face in wild strands, but she didn't brush it away. She was smiling, soft and certain, the kind of smile George had never learned to stop yearning for. "Do you think she'll come back again?" Cecilia asked, not accusing, just curious. George didn't answer right away. He watched the tide pull back, slow and deliberate. "Maybe," he said, "but it won't change anything." He meant it. For the first time, he meant it without hesitation. Whatever still lingered, guilt, grief, the painful ache of nostalgia, it didn't own him anymore. And Allison's shadow no longer stretched across his future. Not when Cecilia stood in the sun beside him. They stayed on the beach until the sky bruised into twilight. Back at the cabin, they'd rented a quiet, two-room place tucked behind a patch of tall grass. They lit a fire and cooked together, laughing at how terrible they both were at cutting onions. Cecilia burned the bread, George oversalted the stew. And yet, it was the best meal he'd had in years. Later that night, George lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling as Cecilia leaned against his chest, tracing shapes on his skin with her fingertip. Do you ever wonder, she murmured, how much damage a person can take before they stop believing in second chances? He turned his head slightly to look at her. I used to think there was a limit, but maybe it's not about how much you take. Maybe it's about finding the one person who makes you want to believe again. She gave a faint, sad smile. I think you needed to break before you could build something real. George closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. He had broken, shattered even, but he'd also been rebuilt, not by Allison, not even by Cecilia alone, but by the choice he'd finally made to stop chasing people who only loved the broken parts of him. The next morning, his phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but when he saw the name Jimmy, he sighed and picked up. George, Jimmy said, voice low, rasping like he hadn't slept. I just thought you should know. Allison left. George sat up, careful not to wake Cecilia. What do you mean, left? Packed up in the middle of the night. No note this time, just gone. George said nothing. I don't know where she's going, Jimmy continued, but I know she's not coming back to me. She said some people deserve better, and some don't know how to give it. George felt a dull ache in his chest, not pain, just the last echo of something that had once mattered too much. She's always been running, he said finally. That was never going to stop with you. Or me. Yeah, Jimmy replied. Just figured you'd want to know. George hung up. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching the pale sunlight creep across the floor. Cecilia stirred behind him. What happened? He turned back to her. She's gone again. Cecilia nodded slowly. Are you okay? I think I finally am, he said. She keeps leaving, but I'm the one who's moved on. That afternoon, they drove back home. George opened the drawer by his bed and took out Allison's letter. He read it one last time, then walked out to the backyard and set it alight in a rusted tin bin. The paper curled and blackened, the ink dissolving into smoke. It didn't feel cruel. It felt finished. Cecilia came out with 2 mugs of tea, wrapping an arm around his waist. No more ghosts? She asked. He smiled down at her. Just memories now, and I've made peace with them. And that night, as they curled up beneath the covers with the window open and the breeze whispering, and George didn't dream of Allison. He didn't relive old wounds. He simply slept with Cecilia's hand in his, and no one else on his mind. Spring came quietly. It wasn't dramatic or showy, just a slow warmth crawling back into the world. Trees started to bloom, windows stayed open longer, and laughter returned to the air like a language the town had forgotten. For George, it felt like a soft reset. Life no longer felt like something he was surviving. It was something he was finally living. He and Cecilia decided to move into a new place, something that didn't smell like the past. The old apartment had too many memories, embedded in the walls, some good, some suffocating. The new place was smaller, but it had more sunlight, creaky wooden floors, and a garden in the back that Cecilia immediately claimed as her own. You're not going to help me with any of this, are you? She asked, digging a trowel into the dirt one afternoon. George leaned against the fence, arms crossed. Absolutely not. I don't trust anything green. Cecilia rolled her eyes. You're hopeless. But she was smiling, always smiling now. They held a small housewarming. Just a few friends, some neighbors. No big declarations, no fireworks. But when someone asked how they met, George surprised himself by answering honestly. She walked into my life when I thought no one ever would again. And he meant it, not in a romanticized way, not in the way he used to speak about love like it was a cure or a dream. No, Cecilia had been something better. She'd been real. Weeks passed. George started writing again, something he hadn't done in years. It wasn't for money or success, just scribbles in a notebook, short thoughts, fragments of stories that lived inside him. Cecilia found one and read it without asking. She didn't say anything at first, just handed the notebook back, her thumb still on the page. This part here, she whispered, where he says, I finally understand why it didn't work before. It wasn't love. It was need. That hit. George looked at her a little embarrassed. I didn't even finish that piece. It's already enough, she said. Sometimes, truth doesn't need a full chapter. One morning, George got a letter forwarded from the old apartment. No name on the envelope, just a single sentence inside. Thank you for saving me even when I didn't want to be saved. A no return address, no way to reply, and he didn't want to. He read it once, folded it up, and slipped it into the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath all the unfinished things he no longer planned to carry. That evening, as the sky turned a lazy pink, George and Cecilia sat in the garden, sipping wine from mismatched mugs. The flowers she'd planted had started to bloom. A few weeds crept in, wild and stubborn, but neither of them minded. "Think we're going to be okay?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder. George looked around, not at the house or the garden, but at her. The way she fit so perfectly beside him, like she'd always belonged there. "We already are," he said, "and maybe that was the truth love never told you in the beginning, that it didn't always come like lightning or feel like fire. Sometimes, it came like this, quiet, gentle, like a smile in someone else's arms after being begged to die for someone who never stayed." The end.